Caving. We've all seen the memes about the disturbing hobby that are going around on TikTok, but I'm sure you don't know just how disturbing the stories can get. Tonight we're going to be exploring the world of caving, so sit back, relax, and get ready to step into the darkness. Before we get into the topic, I just wanted to thank you so much for clicking on this video. If you enjoy, a like and subscribe would mean the world, but without further ado, let's get into the video. So what exactly is caving? It's an activity where people explore underground caves, and it can range from standing up in big open environments to crawling through tiny dark spaces, sometimes with no idea what could possibly be on the other side. It's a very physically and mentally taxing thing to do, and memes have been going viral on TikTok. People find it crazy the lengths that some people will go to in order to have a bit of fun, like cramming their body into small spaces. So I found some of the darkest caving stories from all around the world. To start, we're going all the way back to 1967. There had been good, dry weather in England for a while, and on one summer day, 10 friends banded together and decided that they were going to explore a local cave. It was known as the Mossdale Caverns. Being aware that the cavern was super severe in terms of danger, the group was led by an experienced caver, and the friends all had hope that they could reach the inner depths of the cave, which very few people had actually managed to make the treacherous journey to. The underground passages stretched for over 7 miles, and as the friends entered the cave, everything started off just fine. After exploring for a few hours, 4 members of the group decided that they had had enough and that they were going to stop while they were ahead. They exited the cave safely, but 6 people remained, and they had faith that they would be fine if they just continued to dive deeper into the cave. The clock ticked to 5 PM, and as the 4 exited the cave, they noticed that the dry weather they had had for so long was starting to let up. Rain was dripping, but they thought nothing of it. It's not uncommon for it to be raining in England, and the rain was so little at this point that there was no immediate danger to their friends. So as 3 of the safe cavers made their way to the local village of Ingleton, one decided to stay nearby. As time passed, the rain got heavier, and before long, it turned into a full-blown storm. Concerned that the remaining people inside were now in immediate danger, the remaining friend, Morag Forbes, made her way back to the entrance. Shockingly, the entrance to the cave had now been consumed by a lake of water, and there was no way for her to reach the people who were still inside. She ran 2 miles in the pouring rain to get help, and by 11 PM that night, a rescue operation was in progress. There were a few problems though. The cave was unmapped, with no sort of blueprint about how you could rescue stuck cavers. In addition, the initial rescue team knew that they were going to need many more hands if they were going to attempt to enter the flooded cavern. Cavers from nearby towns, including 2 of the friends who had travelled to the village, made their way out to the cave with gear in hand. They arrived at the entrance, ready to help, but hopes of any sort of rescue were quickly diminished when people realised just how bad things had gotten. The cave entrance was literally a lake at this point. If you didn't know that it was a cave, you couldn't have guessed it because it was completely submerged underwater. The people who had come to the rescue started to create a makeshift dam in order to try and get the water levels down. Eventually, the following morning, the water levels did seem to be falling a bit, enough for divers to get into the cave, but the task was still going to be difficult. A man called Jim Eyre was going to lead the rescue team, and funnily enough, he was actually asked to originally attend this exact cave dive just a week prior. Although he was experienced, he had declined that offer because he had his doubts about exploring the specific cave, but this time he had no choice but to face his fears. Accompanied by some of the original members of the group who had barely escaped the flood, they made their way inside. They made their way past flood debris and remaining water, and eventually they reached a long bit of tunnel referred to as Far Marathon. The tunnel was 900 feet long and would take almost 5 hours to crawl through, but as they started on their journey, they quickly made a horrifying discovery. They found 2 bodies. and the bodies were of some of the people that they were searching for. The cave was so narrow that they had no choice but to crawl over them and search for others, and just a few yards ahead, they found 3 more people, all deceased. There was little communication to the surface, but they did have some, and what they were hearing was awful. They were being told to get out now because the makeshift dam that was holding the water was crumbling. So although they hadn't found the final body of the most experienced caver of them all, they had to make their way out, and that they did. They couldn't bring the 5 bodies that they had found with them because the cave was simply too small. It was an impossible task, especially when you had to do it so quickly. 2 more search parties were brought into the cave in the following days, and although they did find some of the experienced caver's items, they still couldn't find him. By Wednesday, doctors who were experienced in caving tragedies signed an official declaration saying that it's likely he died, and that his body will never be recovered. They say that his body had likely been taken to a deeper, inaccessible point in the cavern by the water. The cave was eventually sealed off with concrete, with all 6 bodies inside, but in 1971, friends of the dead cavers actually managed to get the cave reopened, and they recovered the bodies, burying them in a higher level system known as the Mud Caverns. Skip forward to today and they still remain there, with a plaque on the entrance commemorating them. It remains the most deadliest incident of caving in Britain, but there are many more disturbing stories just like this one. We're going over to America now, where in 1887, a man called Floyd Collins was born. He lived on his dad's farmland, and he discovered that there was a cave underneath it. He called it Crystal Cave, and after exploring it, he turned it into a tourist attraction. And promise was there, because cave tourism was a very lucrative business. It even became very competitive, with shady business practices being used all over the world. But because of the remote location that Floyd's cave was in, he was seeing little to no profit. But he thought that he might have struck the jackpot, because he caught wind of another potential cave that was in a much more accessible area. This one was known as Sand Cave, and he entered into an agreement with the person whose property the cave was on so that he could explore it, and if he deemed it good enough to be turned into a tourist attraction, they would then split the profits. And so, with this in place, he first entered the cave on January 30th, 1925, for what should have been a routine venture for him. He entered with just a single lantern and quickly found out that there was more than he bargained for. It was very small, and some areas were so tight that he even had to crawl through on his stomach. After a while of this, he could see a bigger opening in the distance, but just as he was about to hit the jackpot, his lantern began to flicker as it was losing fuel. He knew he couldn't risk being trapped in a cave without any light, so he began to make his way back up to the surface. But as he inched through the tight passages, his light gave out. But he knew that in that situation, the worst thing that you could do was worry, so he tried to stay calm. He tried to navigate in the dark, but as he pushed his foot against what he assumed to be the wall of the cavern, he accidentally dislodged a 27-pound rock. It immediately trapped his ankle, leaving him unable to move. He screamed out for help, but for a painful 25 hours, no one came. He was all alone in the dark. But after over a day had passed and his throat was aching from yelling, a voice shouted his name. Floyd was known to sometimes not return home after he went on a caving adventure, but since this was a new cave that he hadn't explored before and no one really knew what was inside, the locals were starting to get a bit worried. And sadly, they had every right to be worried. Dozens of locals attempted to brave the cavern in an attempt to rescue the man, but none were successful. Thankfully though, all hope wasn't lost, because when Floyd's brother Homer arrived, he managed to get to Floyd. He couldn't figure out a way to actually free him just yet, but he did manage to call for food, which he fed to his brother by hand. He hacked away at the rocks that were holding Floyd hostage with a crowbar for over 8 hours, but the cave showed no sign of letting up, and he eventually had to give up. And sadly, even though there were literally hundreds of people outside of Sand Cave at this point who had all claimed to have brought Floyd blankets and food, all of them were lying. Homer was the only person to actually reach his brother, and claims from the people who had allegedly gone in that Floyd was in good spirits were nothing more than fabrications. But eventually, they all came up with a plan. They were going to attach a rope to Floyd and yank him out. Doctors and other professionals made clear the risks, but Floyd consented, and Homer, along with some other people who had finally decided to make the journey, attached a rope around his body. The rope was pulled by those on the surface, but almost immediately Floyd let out a scream. His back had been stretched in unnatural ways, and Homer couldn't bear to see his brother in such pain. He pulled the rope towards him, and the men on the surface let go. The rope fell down the shaft as another idea failed, and this time was ticking. Over the next few days, more ideas were pitched, and the most successful was when a reporter who managed to make his way down to Floyd almost managed to pry the rock off his foot. He eventually had to stop, but when he returned to the surface, the situation had gotten so severe that the National Guard had arrived. In the hours that followed, fears were beginning to set in that a cave-in was on the horizon. People who had entered reported that the rocks in the roof started to rumble. It was becoming unstable. Shortly after, rocks began to fall, and it was very clear that the cave was breaking down. Too many people had entered, and although they all had good intent, it ultimately proved to be the downfall. But no one was ready to give up hope just yet. By order of a lieutenant general, people began to dig a shaft that would lead them to Floyd. There was no chance of getting to him through the now caved-in entrance, so this was our last hope. But they quickly realised that if they were to use any sort of heavy machinery, then the cave would consume the fumes and Floyd would literally be gassed, so they had no choice but to reach him using handheld tools. As workers hacked away at the cave walls with blistered hands, thousands watched on. Not a single one of them came to help, and the tragic incident that was still ongoing became a tourist attraction, with some people even selling mementos. The tourists even left after the rescue efforts went on longer than expected, and by this point, Floyd had now been stuck in the cave for over 12 days without any food or water. The odds certainly weren't in his favour, but the good news was that they had almost reached him. They eventually broke through the walls of Sand Cave, and as rocks were pulled apart and rescuers entered, the final bit of hope was upon everyone that was still at the site. People on the surface watched the entrance in silence, waiting for the hopefully good news. But as the rescuer shone his flashlight down the cave, he was not greeted with anything pleasant. Floyd had a gold tooth, and the light was reflecting off it. They had found him, but he did not move. The rescuer was pulled out and simply shook his head as everyone heard the one word that they did not want to hear: dead. It was later discovered that he had been dead for 3 days, and Sand Cave was officially blocked off with soil, with officials deciding that it was far too dangerous to attempt to recover his body. However, that didn't put off his brother. Homer toured across the country for 8 whole months, telling stories about Floyd's childhood, but it wasn't for personal gain, because he was going to use every single bit of the money he made to get his brother out of that cave. And that he did, because after he made enough, 7 miners redug the shaft. They made their way into Sand Cave, removed the rock, and finally recovered the body of Floyd Collins. Floyd was buried in the family cemetery, but sadly that wouldn't last long. His father would be forced into a financial contract that would give a doctor permission to not only exhume the body, but to put it on display in a glass coffin inside of Crystal Cavern. In 1961, the US government bought the cave with Floyd still inside. They eventually closed public access to it, and by 1989, his body had finally been put back into a cemetery. And the display of such a morbid thing was eventually ended. As it turns out, Crystal Cave was actually part of an incredibly massive series of caverns which stretches over 400 miles. Cavers continue to explore it even to this day, and memories of the legendary caver live on. If you go far enough, you might even see the letters FC still carved into the walls. But as for Sand Cave, it's been permanently locked off, being bolted and welded shut by the government. It's likely that it is actually connected to the 400-mile cave system, but after what happened all of those years ago, no one is really too determined to crack the case. But if you think that dry caving is bad, let me introduce you to cave diving, a type of scuba diving where someone explores an underwater cave. And there are just as many disturbing stories related to this type of caving. But one of the saddest and most terrifying is the story of a man called Dave Shaw. Bushman's Hole is a freshwater cave in South Africa, and it is over 900 feet deep. In 1994, diver Dion Dreyer was helping his team prepare for a dive, and on ascent to the surface, he went missing at approximately 164 feet. No one knew what happened to him for ages, and any divers who dared to venture into Bushman's Hole were always keeping an eye out for him. But while exploring one day, Dave Shaw would discover a body that he believed belonged to Dion. The body was on its back with its arms pointing to the surface, and thanks to the water, his exposed head and hands had both become skeletonized. He tried to recover the body there and then, but quickly realized that he could not just do something like that on a whim. His air tank was stuck in the mud underneath him, and Shaw had already overstayed his welcome at the bottom of the sea. So he made his way back to the surface and met up with his friend Don Shirley to share his findings. And on October 30th, 2004, Shaw called up the parents of Dion. He simply said, "I will go and fetch your son." As everyone prepared for what was now dubbed the Big Dive, Shaw was feeling ready. With a makeshift body bag and a date set for January, it was time for things to get underway. And when the day eventually came, everything was ready. There were doctors, police, and Shirley had done everything in his power to make this dangerous dive as safe as possible. Even if initial rebreathers were to fail, there was backup oxygen tanks in the water that could allow you to survive. Support divers were also brought on board, and this seemed to be the safest that such a dangerous exhibition could possibly be. To document it, Shaw teamed up with a South African filmmaker who had managed to create an underwater camera. After some testing, it was proven to work, and Shaw agreed that he would take it down with him. So strapped with a camera and all his gear, he shook Shirley's hand just after 6 AM and said that he would see him again in 20 minutes. He dropped into the dark water below and hit the bottom in just over 11 minutes. He spotted the body that he had discovered months prior and pulled out the body bag that he had brought with him. But on the surface, Shirley was ready to submerge as well. The plan was to meet Shaw at 725 feet, but when he eventually reached that depth, Shaw had not yet arrived. He scanned the cave around him for any sort of sign of his friend, and to his horror, he saw Shaw's light 400 feet below him, and it wasn't moving. This was a sign that something had gone very wrong, because if he was ascending or even breathing, then he would see bubbles. But instead, the only evidence that someone was even down there was a light that was the only thing in the darkness. Knowing that he had to do something, he made his way down to Shaw. But as he continued to get deeper, the device attached to his arm that was used to monitor his oxygen levels smashed into pieces as a result of the pressure. If he had gone down any further, he most certainly would have been a dead man, so he had no choice but to make his way back to higher ground. One of the support divers was meant to meet Shaw and Shirley at 275 feet, but when neither arrived, he decided to dive deeper to find them. At just past 400 feet, he eventually found Shirley. Shirley asked the support diver for an underwater slab to communicate, and he scribbled 4 words on it that would make the diver realize the severity of the situation. The slate read, "Dave not coming back." Another diver joined them shortly after, and he said that he would go down and look for Shaw. But Shirley knew that going down that far was signing your own death warrant, and urged everyone to return to the surface, and that they did. Everyone eventually made their way back to higher ground, but because of decompression, Shirley had to stay underwater for some time. He constantly threw up and said that he was feeling nauseous, but divers accompanied him to make sure that he would not pass out and fall deeper yet again. After a painful 12.5 hours inside of Bushman's Hole, he was pulled out of the water and put into the recompression chamber. As he mourned the death of his friend, and as most of the crew returned home, a few of them stayed. One of the divers who stayed was a man called Peter Herbst, and he would end up making the dive himself. Now just 65 feet down, his light made contact with the body of Shaw. He was floating upright, with his head and his shoulders jammed against the roof of the cave. His light was hanging below, and not far away was the body of Dion. When Shaw's cave line had been pulled during one of the dives, both bodies had been pulled off of the floor, and thus they were now both much easier to recover now that they weren't so deep in the cave. So up came Dion's body. He was put in a white body bag, and Shaw's task had been accomplished, even if it meant that he had passed away doing it. Shaw's body was brought up shortly after, and he actually had to be cut out of his equipment because rigor mortis had set in. But to the surprise of everyone, it was discovered that the camera he had brought with him had actually survived the journey back to the surface. The video is out there on the internet, but I'm obviously not going to be showing it. It's a very disturbing watch because you are witnessing a man's final moments. The reason things had gone so wrong is because when he managed to loosen Dion's body from the mud, it started to float, and he then had the difficult task of trying to put a moving body inside of a bag. His breathing started to get quicker, he was burning through oxygen, and he was clearly in distress. But instead of abandoning his dive, he was determined to finish the job. But after more struggling and as the pressure started to set in, he passed out after 21 minutes, and just a minute later, all movement would fade out. It was ruled after analysis of the video that he had passed out due to a carbon dioxide buildup, and that he actually died from drowning. The saddest part is that because he had freed the body and it was floating, if he had returned to the surface, the body also would have eventually made its way up, just as his did after he passed away. Shaw's ashes were spread a short drive away from Shirley's home, and he says that he will always remember his friend. But this just goes to show how terrifying cave diving can become, even if you think you're experienced enough to truly risk it all. Thank you so much for making it to the end of this video. I really hope you enjoyed. Like, subscribe, share the video with your friends, do all of that good stuff. It really means the world and it really helps the channel. Let me know what you think of some of these caving incidents and if there are any other disturbing stories that you've heard. And don't forget to check out my social media. You can follow me on Blue Sky or Instagram, whatever you prefer. And of course, thank you to my Patreon supporters and YouTube members: Brooke Entreprenaut, Morrigan, K4 Silver, Alex Rod, Based Finger, Carmella, Tango Slime, and Shush. If you want to get early access to videos like this, then you can support me on Patreon for as little as £5 a month. Alternatively, you can click that little join button next to the subscribe button on my channel, but of course all of that's optional and just you watching the videos is more than enough. Have a great weekend, great week, and I'll see you next time.